morning, and welcome to Coffee and Conversations with Community Providers. I'm super excited to have Jack Murphy here. I was trying to think like how long we've known each other.
Probably like 15 years, if
We
not
did
more.
some
Yeah.
autism camps. It's been a pleasure watching your journey over the years. So with that said, just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah. My name's Jack Murphy. I am what people would call ADHD, so that means I am autistic and have ADHD. I have been in what we say the field for 17 years now. I started really early, which gave me a lot of privilege of being in this field. I have my doctorate or my PhD in human sexuality. I focus on sex and disability a lot in my work. I am a board certified behavior analyst and a behavioral sexologist. So, yeah.
Super, super smart, in
Super
other
nerdy.
words. Okay, so your career obviously has taken an interesting path from working in the autism field, getting your PhD in human sexuality. Like, how did you how did those interact, and how did you end up here?
Yeah, I think so. I started really early on a long time ago before there was a lot of licensure laws and requirements and things like that in our field. So, what that did provide me the opportunity was I was working in homes with children with autism. And at some point, I was even living with a family with a child with autism out of the country. So, I really got to experience a lot of things early on that was like more holistically than maybe just like your traditional ABA or in-home
Mm-hmm.
program.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was working with families and getting to talk to people, I really recognized there was like a gap. There was a lot of focus on specific skills and a lot of focus on early intervention in younger folk. But as kids were growing up and we were looking at teenagers and adults, there was just this huge gap in services. And so that kind of was one big aspect for me. And then when I started in college and I was in my undergrad, I took a human sexuality course. And it was just a human sexuality 101. And I remember my professor asking specifically, like this room of college folk, you know, something really simple, like raise your hand if you've ever dated somebody with a disability. And I had already been in the field working with folks with disability for at least 5 plus years at this
Mm-hmm.
time. I felt like a pretty strong advocate. But I looked around the room and I saw, no hands up. And I thought about this, like this bias that we are creating when we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at things like sexuality and disability, and how even me, as somebody who felt very informed, also kind of was creating this story or this narrative that disabled people, and I'm talking about all disabilities, kind of were discounted when it came to romantic partners, sexual
Mm-hmm.
partners, and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And so I think those kind of two pieces led me on this path of like, this is something that I want to talk about, something that needs to be discussed more openly, which then led me to like furthering my education and just kind of really diving in deep, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense.
So that was a very pivotal moment in your
Yeah.
lifetime. So thank you, Professor, whoever you are. Thank
Amanda
you.
Morgan, I can
Yay,
say. Yeah.
Amanda Morgan.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
Amanda. Okay. So, sexuality is a natural part of being a human, right? But it's not always discussed openly, as we all know. And especially when disability comes into play. Like, why do you think this topic is so overlooked and avoided? Is it because people are just uncomfortable about the subject, or what is it?
Yeah, I think we have to look at historically where we come from, and I'm talking about we colloquially as like the West, that
Mm-hmm.
we've been shaped by like fairly puritanical values. And so when we're looking at historically how we viewed sexuality, having open conversations about this really wasn't permitted. And so even when we look at sexuality as a study, right, when we look at sexology, it had to be kind of viewed through a medical lens in order to legitimize it, right? We were
Mm.
uncomfortable with talking about sex, but if we talk about it in a way that is medicalized, such as like function and things like that, we could kind of squeeze by and then start looking at this as a science. And
Mm-hmm.
so through this medical lens, then we also add a section of disability, which, disabled folk are often left out of conversations in research,
Mm-hmm.
especially when we're looking at sex. It's very considered taboo. But when we look at disabled folk, we are looking at a lot of those things like function, fertility, safety, risk, rather than things like desire and intimacy and pleasure. And so while this approach has helped us establish the field of sexuality and disability, it really narrowed our conversation. And as a result, these kinds of topics have been limited for, and I'm talking about like a section of people who are really like immersed in this academia, which then only trickles down into how we view it as society. So we sideline it, even though this is like, we know, a central piece of our overall well-being. So yeah, it's that we're uncomfortable. It's that we haven't had it modeled. We don't have a frame of reference. Obviously, as things are becoming more mainstream, things like Love on the Spectrum, which has its problems, but I'll just, like, as we start seeing more representation in media, there's more conversations about it, but it's been so limited and so late into kind of our life. I mean, I remember when I first started telling people what I did, there was always like, wait, what? Like, you do what? And now the conversation has shifted a little bit, and people are always like, have you seen Love on the Spectrum? Or
and
have
intrigued.
You watched this? Yeah.
Yes. So I feel like Love on the Spectrum's kind of opened the door a little bit for this.
There is some definite positives of like having these conversations, right? What we see represented in media and society in our world definitely starts to help like this little bit of a shift.
Sure.
The only problem is when it's the only frame of reference we have, but that's not what today's about. But yeah, I think it's discomfort, and that we just don't really know. And it takes people, it takes things like this podcast, it takes kind of like stepping out in that discomfort to really like make change happen.
Yeah, for sure. What has been some of the biggest myths you've encountered or misconceptions, as being in this field about sexuality and disability?
Right. I think it's interesting because we have like this dual framing, right? One side, we see people with disabilities and we usually look at them as asexual, right? So somebody who has no sexual interest or no romantic interest, no desire for these types of relationships. Or we pin them on the other end where we talk about like hypersexuality or people engaging in inappropriate sexual behaviors. And so both stereotypes are kind of like denying this reality that people with disabilities have a variety of sexual expression just like anybody else, right? This is part of a normal human experience. There's this myth that, especially when we're looking at the autistic population, that there is a preference for being, isolated or on your own, and there is no interest in other people. And that's because we kind of are viewing it, people are viewing it from like a non-autistic perspective and what that might look like, what relationships look like, what conversations look like. And we're kind of overgeneralizing that to, romantic relationships, sexual experiences. And so in reality, I think the barriers for disabled people are, not having conversations about this misconception of what this could look like for them. It's like a societal barrier. And so I think when we look at sex and disability, we also, especially if we're looking at physical disability, we then tend to turn to function. And function can matter for sure, but sexuality is so much more than just like, penetrative sex. It's so much more than just the actual act of sex. It's our identity, it's relationships, communication, it's pleasure, it's self-expression, and all of these deserve attention for all people, including those people with disabilities.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. The way you explain things is just incredible. So thank you for being so open and honest with this podcast. So we have been hosting a sex education series together here at FEAT, and 95% of the people have been super open and appreciative because they've seen things in their loved one and they're not sure how to teach them and work with them. So they've been open and they love what we're doing. But we've also gotten some critical feedback, some not so happy customers. Why do you think that is? And what do you hope people take away from these discussions that we're having?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that we've got some of the feedback because conversations about sexuality can really challenge deeply held beliefs. We're talking about cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, personal beliefs. And I think there's a misinformation that if we're talking about, we'll say sex education or sexuality, it's that we're encouraging sexual behaviors. And there's so much more than that. So we're pushing against like longstanding assumptions about who has been seen as a sexual being and who is kind of worthy of these discussions. So that can make people uncomfortable. But I think that it's important to recognize that discomfort doesn't mean like that this conversation shouldn't be happening, right?
Sure.
It's an opportunity to examine, okay, where are these feelings coming from? Why am I having these assumptions? And kind of checking ourselves and recognizing how we can move forward. Because I think what happens a lot is, especially in my line of work, I'll be contacted after something, right? Families are having a challenge. I'm getting contacted by the day court, the court for individuals with disabilities who have maybe been in some form of legal challenges, and it's a very reactive response, right? It's like, oh, now something happened, can you help me? And if we could really flip the conversation, and I'm sure we'll get to this later, and be proactive, we could really help build skills to avoid any type of challenges like that. And so I think the takeaway is that, sexuality is a a normal part of our human life. It's part of our well-being, and people with disabilities deserve the same opportunities for education around this as anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And whether somebody agrees with every perspective or every piece, I think I encourage people to learn and get that information. I hope that people who participated in our series, it was just encouraging like this curiosity or empathy and recognition that avoiding these conversations is definitely not the answer. It doesn't make
Mm-hmm.
these needs disappear. It doesn't make
Exactly.
these challenges disappear. It
Mm-hmm.
just makes it harder for people to access accurate information.
Yeah.
And there's a whole load of problems and challenges that come with that.
And kudos to the people that are showing up, even if they're uncomfortable. I mean, we all want as parents what's best for our loved ones and the community that we work with. It may be a little bit uncomfortable, but you know what? When she does these trainings, she makes you feel so at ease and she explains it just beautifully. So thank you for what
Yeah.
you're doing and thank you for partnering with us on this super important topic. Okay. So parents, caregivers, and supporters, if they want to approach these conversations, but they're unsure, probably uncomfortable, they don't know where to begin, like what guidance and how can you create a space talking to your loved one about these, topics? Because the hormones are racing, all these things happen with our kids, whether we want to believe it or not, it happens. So, what do you think, like age appropriate? How do you?
Yeah, like we mentioned, I'm a big proponent for like proactive teaching, right?
Mm-hmm.
Coming from a background in ABA or any really form of education, we want to be proactive in teaching prior to like events happening, right? That's just
Mm-hmm.
going to be the most advantageous way. And so in my field in human sexuality, we're big proponents of lifelong sex education. So again, reiterating that sex education is not just about sex acts or
Mm-hmm.
penetrative sex or even solo sexual behaviors. There's
Mm-hmm.
a variety of things that come to this. So when I'm talking about like sexuality for the lifespan, when we look at other places outside of the US, right? Like when we look at Canada and other places, there's like beautiful sex education that is, it starts very young. It starts with, body parts. It starts with your
Mm-hmm.
anatomy and understanding, and it kind of gets more complex as individuals age, that you're just building on these skills, especially when we're talking about people with disabilities, right? Sometimes it can take a long time to learn a skill. And so the earlier you start, the more likely you're going to have those skills learned by the time that you need them. So for
Mm-hmm.
parents, I really, really encourage, starting early, keeping conversations ongoing, and remembering that this is just about helping people understand themselves. And there are ways to teach all of these content all of these concepts for a variety of individuals with a variety of needs of support. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
people will ask me like, am I just talking about autistic folk level 1? And no, absolutely not. I work with a lot of individuals who would be a higher support needs, maybe have no verbal communication, maybe
Mm-hmm.
are, in some form of group facility living, that
Mm-hmm.
we can still teach, autonomy and consent and
Mm-hmm.
boundaries and solo sexual practices or whatever their sexual practices may be with health and safety in mind. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just this one big talk that we tend to do
Sure.
here,
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
series of smaller age appropriate conversations that evolve
Mm-hmm.
over time. And I also encourage, I think a lot of times when I meet with parents, there's like a barrier because they're like, I don't know this stuff, right? Or my
Mm-hmm.
parents never had this talk with me. And I think that's so valid. And like,
Mm-hmm.
I asked, one of the things in our first trainings was people to raise their hand if their parents ever had the sex talk with them, and then keep their hand up if they've had it with their own child. And all, hands are down, right?
Down.
And it's like, great, this was probably not that fun of an experience for you. Like, let's not let this be continuing on for other people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I always encourage also, like, it's okay to not have the answers, right? It's okay to not have the answers before or as they're coming up, but you can look these things up together. You can learn it with your child. You can
Mm-hmm.
educate yourself. That way you can feel more comfortable and informed having those conversations. Because if we can create a space where people can come to you without fear or embarrassment, then you're much more likely to have someone
Mm-hmm.
seek guidance when they need it,
Mm-hmm.
and really kind of avoid some of the things that we are so concerned about, right? A lot of times when parents come to me, it's like, I don't want to talk about this because I'm worried XYZ. But if we can educate prior on, we can kind of catch those things before it
Mm-hmm.
happens. Hopefully that makes
I
sense.
mean, I think our one of our main goals of doing this series with you was to keep our kids and our loved ones out of the system. You don't want to get to that point where they've gotten in trouble for something.
Yeah.
I think that's what we all fear, right?
Mm-hmm.
As parents, you just want to keep your kids safe. And this is one of those topics. They have all the same feelings as the rest of us that we just want them to know, even touching someone,
Mhm.
holding, trying to grab someone's hand. If the girl or guy is not, open with that, they need to know to step back, those types of things. So,
Yeah, I think that the conversation around safety and like disciplinary action and things is usually how I get my foot in the door, right?
yeah.
We want to, because when we look at disabled population, obviously it is a population that is at risk, right, for being a
Mm.
survivor of some form of
Mm-hmm.
sexual assault, trauma, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. But they're also at risk for perpetrating, for
Perpetrating,
being
yeah.
people who, engage in unconsensual behaviors with others.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's usually my foot in the door is safety. And then I'm always like, well, let's push it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Safety is important, but how about pleasure? How about quality of life?
Yep.
How about like, just bringing joy? How about, leisure and those things? And so safety is usually how I get my
How
foot in
you
the
get
door.
in.
And
Yes.
then I always want to expand, but also like, isn't it just nice to, have a relationship with someone? Isn't
Mm-hmm.
it nice? Orgasms are great. Isn't this something that we should talk about for all bodies and all people? So just to throw that in there too.
No, thank you for that. So we might have already covered it a little bit,
A
but
lot of it.
professionals, educators, service providers, what do you wish they understood more? I don't know, with the different providers around town that anybody even discusses this. What do you wish and hope, for these providers to understand and maybe work into these kids' treatment plans and, can
Yeah.
you expand on that?
Yes. I do think that as professionals, there is a space for us in these conversations, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think, like you mentioned, a lot of people don't talk about it. A lot of times when I meet families, and I'm talking the last 5 years, so from BCBA clinical practice to like, advocate to working in the school district, I was often the first person to ask parents about like, hey, let's talk about some of these other like
Mm-hmm.
more personal behaviors, and these are people who have been through treatment for a long time, been in the school district, and they've like nobody's ever asked me that,
Nobody.
and I haven't really had families outwardly say it unless they're coming to me from like the day court. Usually, it's not something
Sure.
that parents will disclose until I ask it, and so I think the first piece is like we have to start having these conversations,
Mm-hmm.
right? There is a place to discuss, private versus public, consent, boundaries, all of those more early critical skills in things
Mm-hmm.
like early intervention, in school programs, in ABA programs. But even when we look at things like, I'm going to talk about like solo masturbation and orgasm or aorgasm, the difficulty of orgasming, like these are things that should be talked, especially with like, psychiatrists, when we're talking about families who are on medication. Like
Mm-hmm.
all of these things can impact your hormones and your ability to achieve orgasm, which can be really frustrating. We're talking about motor skills, we're talking about OT. Like there's a lot of services that wrap
Mm-hmm.
up into this. So I do think one is like we need to kind of address this holistically. But the caveat is like this is also a very special subject, right? And it's very delicate. And if you don't have the education or the training to do those things,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be really careful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't want to perpetuate harm. We do not want to create, an at risk situation, right? So when even myself, like I work with a lot of clients with I'm going to say masturbation just because it's a very common thing,
Mm-hmm.
there is a huge line that seems very clear to me about how to work on these things with people and how to discuss it and how to
Mm-hmm.
educate and visual supports and what they can look like and how to make sure it's informative but not pornographic, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
as just one tiny example. But that is something that I spent a good part of my life dedicated to
Mm-hmm.
understand. So I think it needs to be addressed. There is a room or a space for almost all professionals, but it does require collaboration. It requires
Mm-hmm.
conversations with other providers, because if this isn't something that you've done specific education and training in, you can also perpetuate harm and
Mm.
create uncomfortable
I would
situations.
imagine.
And
Mm-hmm.
so one of my favorite things is when I do like, because there are sexuality assessments, just like there are assessments in ABA,
Wow.
right? There are
Okay.
assessments to kind of determine,
I learned something.
knowledge, understanding, attitudes, like, and where to start, right, to create a treatment plan.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things after I do that is I kind of break down the skills that need to be taught, and I sit with families and I say, here are the things that are really important. Here are the things that I think I should teach. Here are all the things that I think you should teach. And what this should look like or could look like is sometimes it's me training parents and parents
Very
being the
collaborative.
ones.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yeah, in a perfect world, I wouldn't be doing this at all, right? It
Mm-hmm.
would be coming from families and caregivers, but that's just not the reality. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that we have to recognize that. But there are different levels or layers of how involved a professional can or even should be,
Mm-hmm.
right? An
Mm-hmm.
occupational therapist could talk about fine motor skills and maybe different grip strengths and exercises, right? But when it actually comes to engaging in like masturbation, there should be a huge separation from that occupational therapist and the individual who's engaging in that
Mm-hmm.
practice. So how do we get those skills taught? Again, these are like more complicated, nuanced things, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess to sum it up again, there need to be having conversations about this, but also we need to collaborate and work with the people who
Yeah.
are experienced in this
Yeah.
field.
And education,
Yeah.
collaboration. So obviously, you're available
Yes, yeah, please.
to work with providers and
Mhm.
work with families and individuals. You know, if people that are listening to this are interested in obtaining your services, how do people go about doing
Yeah,
that?
please contact me. Please. I love this is my special interest. People can reach me via email, will probably be the easiest one. So my email is Dr. Jacqueline, I don't know, I'm spelling it out, JCKLYN, Murphy,
Mhm.
WRPHY at gmail.com. I'm sure we'll put it in the credits.
Yes,
And
we'll put it.
so, yeah, people can contact me via email and then we can coordinate. Like, it could be Zoom calls, it can be in person collaboration, whatever that might look
They
like.
can
Yeah.
join our series
Yeah.
that we're doing right now.
Yeah, there's so much
Yes.
and so many more things to come for sure.
And after the response that we've gotten on this series, I can bet that we'll probably be doing it again, even with the naysayers. We're gonna just keep. It's just so important. I have a 27-year-old daughter, and I think I've this is a topic for sure. So thank you so much for your knowledge, for your expertise, for working with these incredible kids. It's been a pleasure watching you grow over these years, and now she's a freaking PhD. I'm so darn proud. But thank you, thank you, thank
No,
you
thank you
for
for
all
having
that
me.
you do and making it easy to talk about an uncomfortable
Yeah, absolutely.
topic.
Thank you so
So
much.
thank you. Appreciate you.